Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Denise Rock, and I am a Project Deliveries Coordinator with the Office of Environmental Management here in Tallahassee. My focus within the office is on species-related issues under NEPA review, and I have been with DOT for about 4.5 years. Today, we are fortunate to have folks with us here from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to discuss the eastern black rail and answer any questions that you may have about the species. But first, we have a little bit of housekeeping. So for the GoTo platform, questions are encouraged and the question box will be monitored throughout the webinar. So please send your questions and comments to our presenter through the question box at any time during the presentation. Also, the webinar will be recorded and made available on our website on our protected species and habitat page. The address is on the slide and it will be put in the chat as well. And it should be up within the next few days. So with that, I'm going to introduce Caroline Walker. Caroline is with the Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Panama City office. Caroline is a biologist with the Division of Environmental Review at the service, and her background is in conservation of bird species. Black rails are of particular interest to her because of their elusive nature and their use of some of the region's most exquisite habitats, and she will be monitoring our question box today during the webinar. Caroline?
Thanks, Denise, and thank you for the kind introduction. Well, thank you all for participating in this Eastern Black Rail FDOT FWS project training. We've been receiving quite a few questions regarding the need to consult on black rails in Florida and how to go about it. We hope this training answers many of your questions. The objective of the training is to provide you with additional resources when black rails have the potential of being in your project areas, and also to provide some more consistent messaging statewide. Your primary Fish and Wildlife Service contacts for FDOT projects should still be Amber, Zakia, John, and Mark, depending on which region you're working in. The outline of this webinar will be an introduction of Eastern Black Rail, including its biology and habitat identification. We will also discuss how to determine if a site is suitable for black rails and how to set up surveys to determine if black rails are present. And then also how to go about doing some of these surveys to obtain presence absence at your sites. If you have questions during the webinar, as Denise mentioned, please do ask them by using the chat box. I'll be monitoring the questions and reading them out when we get to good stopping points in the webinar. If I don't read yours out, answers may be forthcoming later in the webinar. If I still don't get to your question, please feel free to re-ask. We at the Fish and Wildlife Service would like to thank Katasha, Denise, and their team at FDOT for recognizing the need for this webinar and hosting us. And of course, Kendra for being the best tech guru we've got. So thank you to her for organizing this webinar. Now on to the presentation. Your primary presenter is Kevin Kalis with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He is Florida's Black Rail Species Lead. Kevin has quite a bit of experience with this species since he's been working with black rails since the early 2000s along the East Coast as well as Gulf Coast of the United States. He's now based in Florida as a coastal program coordinator. Kevin, you want to take it away?
Hey everybody, and thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Coastal Program Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service in South Florida, Everglades. Do a lot of habitat restoration work for the coastal program, but lucky enough to be able to delve into some black rail work as the service's state lead for the species. Super happy that all y'all have made it here, and hopefully you'll enjoy this presentation. Hopefully you might learn a couple things. There's a lot of information out there on black rails. Feel free to look stuff up, but this is really this presentation is really intended to provide a background on the species, on its population, and its ecology, so that you understand when you're out in the field, when you're evaluating projects, kind of like what to look for, what rails like, and how you might address a situation in the wetlands that might have black rails. I just want to say that this is a species that you will probably never see, but you'll hopefully hear, and hopefully in the coming years, and we'll hear more and more of as we try to recover the species and get it back on a good trajectory for population recovery. I hosted in the Northeast, I hosted a meeting to understand the status of the species in the Northeast in 2013. And I brought together all the biologists from all the states in the Northeast, and many of them had worked decades, 20, 30, 40 years on black rails, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I think there's about 15 or 16 of us there, and only like a quarter of them had ever seen a black rail. So super elusive bird. That's what makes it challenging, not only to understand with regard to its conservation, but also, challenging to understand how we, best protect its habitat when we evaluate projects like this. So I'm going to take my video off because you'll want to look at me the entire time, and go through the presentation. There's going to be a couple of places for questions that you should be able to stop, and you can type in the chat. We'll pause for a minute, and there's going to be a break. And hopefully enjoy it. Thanks. So this is a species that, like I said, we call it a secretive marsh bird. It's super hard to detect. It's small. It's only 5 or 6 inches high. It likes to nest in very, very dense vegetation. It rarely flies. You rarely see it flying unless it's disturbed for some reason. And it's this little black bird with a rusty nape and red eyes. They nest in, their habitat is dense vegetation with very shallow or moist soil, and they'll put their nests in, and they'll hide their nests and build a nest in that shallow water, a few centimeters off the surface of the ground. I actually was able to find some nests after we did a burn in the marsh in Delaware, and they were literally built off the, just a little bit off the ground, with a little ramp leading up to it. So it was very clear what that nest was. The canopy cover is 100%. They're gonna like, if they can see the sky, they're probably not going to be very happy. But again, the vegetation density, herbaceous vegetation density, and the presence of moist soil or water is key to determining where they're going to be. This is a species, the eastern black rail ranges from Colorado all the way to the East Coast, and from basically North Carolina to Texas. Mostly it's a tidal high marsh species. That's why we have this this map here. I think it's a little bit older map based on what we know now, especially for Florida. They like that tidal high marsh habitat. But that crosshatches, we do have a lot of records of them nesting in inland freshwater habitat, and that's one of the conservation strategies we have, is to get them from a more risky tidal situation to a more stable inland freshwater habitat and provide opportunities there. So a pretty wide-ranging species, but very much in decline. This is a map of the species occurrence from, on the left is prior, the counties that they occurred in prior to 2016, and on the right is where we have black rails since then. So pretty dramatic decline, and there's actually been a range contraction from historical distribution along the eastern coast. Black rails nested up into Massachusetts. By 2016, they're only nesting up to Delaware Bay, and by 2020, that range had contracted to only as far north as North Carolina. So a pretty dramatic decline in a very short period of time. This is the estimated number of pairs that we have for the eastern black rail population. In 2016, we estimated 355 to 815 pairs across the range. We had that range contraction. Now we're down to 230 to 575 pairs. And in Florida, we have an estimated 200 to 500 pairs. And that might be a little bit conservative based on the amount of habitat out there, but there are some difficulties in what we know about black rail habitat use in Florida I'll get into later. There we go. So in Florida, this is a model that the Atlantic Coast, our partners at the Services Atlantic Coast Joint Venture put together several years ago, looking at some of the hot spots in Florida that we had known locations of black rail. And you can see that there's hot spots on the Big Bend area and around Cape Canaveral, and then a whole bunch of these occurrences in kind of inland Florida and the Everglades. So when I think about black rails in Florida, I think about three different kind of ecoregions. One is those tidal situations, the tidal high marsh in like from Cape Canaveral north to Georgia, Florida line, and then the Big Bend and Panhandle region. Tidal high marshes are irregularly flooded wetlands at the very highest point of the tide line, tidal inundation line, and they normally would flood a few times a month. At the various and dominated by things like Spartina patens, Distichus, things like that. Those salt meadow cordgrass, things that are the grasses that are very high, some high tide bush, and things like that. And then we have the inland areas in Florida, in North and Central Florida, in the Panhandle. And these are those wetland areas that the freshwater wetlands that we believe black rails can show up in. So all throughout this kind of light blue area of the state, birds can show up. Again, these are maybe smaller wetlands, maybe a little bit more ephemeral, probably well understood and not well studied with regard to specifically for black rails, but often have the appropriate conditions for what the species likes. And then we have the Everglades. And the Everglades are, in my estimation, probably harboring more black rails than we realize based on the size and complexity of the wetland system there. We're finding black rails in fallow fields of the sugarcane ag district south of Lake Okeechobee, along canals and levee systems in Everglades proper, in Fakahatchee Strand and Big Cypress, anywhere where there's wetlands in the Everglades that are shallow to moist soil. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so this is your canvas. This is where the birds might be and where you need to be considering black rails for projects. So there's a lot of reasons for the decline of black rails, and I think if we understand reasons for declines, that we can understand the species a little bit better. Wetland modifications are certainly something. Disrupting that hydrology, making things wetter or drier in places is certainly an issue for the species. Sea level rise, especially on that in the coastal systems, in the tidal marine systems, is increasingly one of the major problems, especially like in the Northeast, where the tidal fluctuations, the tidal range is much higher. And what we've seen is with sea level rise, the inundation frequency is greater in the high tides, in the high marsh, and the frequency is greater, flood frequency is greater, and it pushed the kind of habitat, either flooded it too much and converted it to low marsh, or pushed the species closer and closer to the upland fringe, which probably helped expose them to more predators. Down here in the Southeast and in Florida and the Gulf Coast, lack of fire in some areas is probably a contributing factor. Fire suppression in the marshes would allow for increase in woody vegetation, which the birds aren't super interested in being around woody vegetation, but we're also finding that these birds are weird and probably are adapting to some levels of woody vegetation, but we kind of want to minimize that in what we do for conservation and what we think about with regard to suitable habitat. So presence of woody vegetation, shrubs and the like in wetlands won't be a disqualifier as to whether or not the habitat would be suitable. So we have this inundation frequency and duration that can happen in tidal systems, and it can happen in the Everglades systems and even in freshwater systems when things kind of get out of what we would consider normal with regards to water management, flood, drought regimes, things like that. And this is just an example of what's happened in the Mid-Atlantic, where they are losing at a very significant rate their tidal wetlands. So the flood inundation frequency for black rail should be at an appropriate level. It should be considered a disturbance if there's a coastal storm while birds are nesting in our coastal systems that push too much water on the landscape or increases the storm surge at an appropriate time. That disturbance could flood chicks and eggs and things like that. They like to have a disturbance frequency that is fairly wide. Once that disturbance frequency starts to get less and less, you reach a tipping point where the birds think that the habitat looks good. The habitat structure, the grasses and everything there looks good. But they're not expecting the disturbance frequency, the floods and the tides to to expose them to high waters as frequently as they do. And so they try to nest, and then they repeatedly get flooded. And so that becomes a demographic sink and contributes to the decline in the species. And so, you know, what we're looking for is to evaluate the local situations, whether it be tidal or freshwater or Everglades, and look at what that hydrology is doing. If the inundation is too frequent, we're going to push that that population below above a threshold, and that's going to trigger the need for additional management, and that's additional resources on all of us to try to reverse those declines. And we can relate this is related to sea level rise, but we can relate this to anywhere where wetlands have, the hydrology has changed in wetlands, and we're trying to improve conditions, restore conditions on landscape. Black rail is the kind of true Goldilocks of the avian world. They like things just right. As I mentioned, they like the habitat. The habitat needs to be an area where there's moist soil to shallow water, and hopefully that shallow water is kind of flowing or in some sort of situation where it's refreshed. So here you see like a flood inundation. You might think of this as on a annual cycle of being a tidal regime. You might think of this on a yearly cycle of being flood and drought years. So they don't like it too wet. They don't like to get their bellies wet. They don't like it too dry. If it's too dry, they don't have the food resources they need to survive and to produce the chicks and to do that. But what we do know is in Florida, and I'll probably talk about this later, is that wetland conditions change over the course of the year. We have wet seasons and dry seasons in Florida, and so that changes how we think about how black rails are using the area. So if I'm in a wetland in, say, June, which is maybe towards the end of a nesting season, and it's got very dense vegetation, but the ground is pretty dry, the birds might still be there. They might have nested in that area, and they might still be nesting in that area because they're not very, if the hydrology is such that there's nearby shallow water, nearby moist soils within kind of their territorial range, they can still get to those areas. But they're responding to those local conditions that are providing for the resources that they need. So in order to facilitate providing for habitat for the species, we can do a couple of things. We can modify or improve the hydrology, add water if it's too dry. If it's too wet, we might be able to add topography. Something that we do in restoration, in the restoration world with regard to black rails, is to try to provide that habitat heterogeneity, the elevational heterogeneity, some humps and bumps in wetlands, so that they can have refuge during wet or flood years and have a little bit of high ground to get to, or they can have some sumps and some water available even when it's dry in the dry years. And like I said, they primarily like open view sheds. They don't necessarily like to be around woody vegetation, shrubs and trees and the like, that just increases their exposure to mammalian predators. So we try to minimize woody vegetation, and in some areas in their range, they actually have cattle grazing. This is something in Texas, so the cattle will make the vegetation too sparse for the rails to like, so we want to reduce grazing. And if it's too woody, use some fire, chemical treatment, or even grazing in that situation as well. And these are the kinds of things that are particularly important when we're thinking about some of our inland black rail sites. Some of the wet prairies and dry prairies in the central portion of the state, where we have ranch lands and things like that, where there's pockets of wetlands available to be utilized by black rail. So all these things are things that we consider with regard to the conservation of the species and the recovery of the species, but also with regard to figure out where they are in the landscape, with regard to how to protect what is remaining. So they have all those factors, all those things, and it's just that one little sweet spot of the right amount of lack of woody vegetation and the right amount of water during the critical time of year during their nesting season to provide for the habitat that they need. And these are the things that we are working with in Florida so much. Like Florida is a land of fire and water. Most of our systems are driven by one or both of those things. So I will pass this off to Caroline and see if there's been any questions.
Yes, so we have a couple of questions here. The first one actually the first one is there a nesting season? I know you're getting to a slide on that, so yes. I'm going to leave that for the next section. Next question, are drainage ditches to a certain degree utilized by this species?
And we will get to that question as well, but a short answer is yes, depending on the size. If there's enough kind of habitat available on that kind of drainage ditch to upland transition, they have been known to use those kinds of situations. Depends on the site. It's very small drainage ditches, no. But if it's part of a wetland system, canal system, things like that where the habitat is sufficient enough to provide for enough habitat for a territory, which is going to be about a hectare, give or take, depending on condition, region of the U.S. and probably region of the state. But that's kind of a good measure for what we would consider a typical home range for nesting pair.
Okay, and next question, I'm going to actually split this up into two parts. What is the species nest site fidelity like?
That's a good question. Nest. So that's part of what I'm kind of setting up for is that. Well, one, this is a difficult species to study, and so we don't have a lot of information on individual movements. We're trying to get to that. We've got we're trying to put out some radio tags and like Panhandle and things like that. But they don't go far. But they will respond to fire and flood and things like that, and move around the landscape within season. So they probably do re-nest. They may double brood within a nest. we don't know if they come back to the same area year after year. We just don't know enough about the species, period, for that kind of discrete understanding.
So you partially answered this next question right there, but I'll go ahead and ask it. How readily will they re-nest if hydrologic conditions become unfavorable over the course of a season or multiple years?
We think that and this is a lot of supposition, but we think that if the conditions in a wetland where they're nesting sufficiently change early enough, that they would re-nest and double brood. And that's particularly true for kind of North Florida, north of Okeechobee, and the inland areas. What we don't understand and is what the nesting season looks like in Everglades and South Florida. There's no indication that they necessarily, based on how what the water management is like, that they could nest any time of year. We do have records of young during weird times of the year, like I believe it was in December, January in the Everglades. So yeah, this is still something that we're trying to figure out, but the guidelines that we're providing with regard to nesting season should be appropriate for the best available knowledge that we have.
Okay, that's it for the questions. You got a great presentation, so kudos.
Thanks. All right, and on we go. I'm going to take myself off and continue. So the thing about Florida is how do we apply kind of the biology of the species to the habitats in Florida, and particularly in the context of understanding like what the impact might be for proposed projects for Department of Transportation and any other thing. This species could occur in most ecosystems throughout Florida, most wetlands throughout Florida. We've seen them appear in the inland areas and in inland freshwater systems in the Everglades, and in the coastal systems. And so the best thing when you're evaluating projects is to understand your local site and understand, have a good grasp of its hydrology. You know, what's driving the water delivery for that wetland. Is it an inland site where you know that's a wet season, dry season situation? Is it actively managed by water management districts? Is it Everglades thing? What's the inundation frequency if it's a tidal system? You know, what's going on in the Upper St. Johns system with regard to hydrology, and that understanding can provide the clues that you need in order to understand the habitats suitable, and if you might find rails. What we are finding is that birds will move within and between seasons based on the presence of water. As I said, the vegetation structure is super important. They want to have that dense, grassy, herbaceous vegetation, limited woody vegetation. But when it all comes down to where they throw that nest is going to be where that hydrologic condition is right for them at the right time of year. And so that's what makes it so difficult in Florida, because so many of our wetlands are managed, so many of them are driven by floods and storms and drought years and flood years and everything that seems to be changing at such increased frequency recently. So There have been years where we have gone out to places where we've known black rails to be it's a known black rail suitable habitat. They've nested there for years. Didn't find them, and then got a report of a bunch of calling males at a water management district reservoir construction site. So for whatever reason during that year, whether it was flood or drought, those local birds found that construction site that had the appropriate vegetation, happened to be all exotic grasses and plants, but it was dense cover and it had the right hydrologic condition. So we know they move between seasons. We know they find the conditions that they need across the landscape, and we know that those conditions can change from one year to the next. And we also believe that they can do this within a season. They will follow. We think that they follow the water. They follow those conditions. They'll nest in one area that might be maybe a little lower or a little bit lower in elevation early in the season. And as rainy season comes in, they may move up to higher points as the rainy season begins. Florida's just a weird situation. Black rails coming from, cutting my teeth in the high tide marshes in the Delaware Bay system, where we knew exactly what was driving the water and where the birds should be, and it was easier. Florida's not like that. So I'm going to provide a few examples of some novel places where, maybe not novel to Florida, but unexpected places where birds are nesting in Florida. You have Avon Park Air Force Range is an example of an inland kind of prairie system where that have interspersed wetlands. And this is a site that has that dense grassy vegetation, as you can see in there, but also has a little bit of woody vegetation around and some shrubs. And they're nesting here. And this is an area where we have black rails. And the interesting kind of broader landscape component about this is it is closer to in the distance of that bottom center picture. There is, beyond that little shrub line, there is a much deeper wetland of sawgrass that they probably nest in this dense vegetation, but I'm sure they foray out into that. If it gets dry up there, they probably go for a walk to that wetter area when they need to. So that might be important when thinking about habitat at the landscape scale, is having close proximity to more stable water sources. This is a wetland complex in the South Florida Water Management District, and you see that levee system in the corner there. There's a vehicle, and just for that vehicle is a patch of dense vegetation that we had a calling bird come from. So this is another example of a wetland system that provides the patchiness, the variability in geography of the elevation to provide for the habitat that the bird needs. Now, is this a source or a sink? We don't know that. It's hard enough to detect the birds, let alone their nests. So tracking the fate of nests has been almost non-existent for black rails. So there's some really amazing work done by Christy Hand in South Carolina. And if you have a chance, you should look up and Google Christy Hand black rails in South Carolina. There should be some really nice video of the work that she's doing up there. If I get a chance, I'll post that video if I can find it for you guys to look at later. We'll come back to this area in a little bit. And I do have a little bit of a video, and this will show you kind of that wetland situation and the wetland complex in just north of the Everglades. And so this is the patch that we feel like the birds are calling from. It's pretty small, but and surrounded by deeper water, but apparently ahead what the birds were needed with regard to vegetation cover and access to moist soil and water. And as the season progressed, that got a little bit drier for them. And then in parts of the Everglades, this is Everglades Water Management District, or Everglades FWC's Everglades Wildlife Management Area. At the southern part of their area, as the water flows south and as the waters rise, the marsh vegetation actually delaminates from the surface and begins to float. And these guys have detected black rails on these floating mats, such as you see here. This is just a small one. We didn't get down far enough into their wetlands to see the larger ones, but these can be as big as a room or a small house, floating mats of vegetation. They've been able to find black rails. So these birds are, like I say, they are adapting to the conditions that are presented to them, and they're doing the best that they can to survive. They're not amazingly abundant, and so we still have a lot of work to do on as far as understanding of what's driving their populations and how we can increase their population sizes and increase their nesting success. But I'm encouraged that there's seems to be a lot of opportunity in Florida to conserve those species and hopefully, recover it so it's no longer threatened with extinction. And I'll take a second here for any comments or questions.
Yep. Let's see. Denise, correct me if I'm wrong. The question was, after this webinar, will these PowerPoints be available for reference? I believe that we are recording this webinar, correct?
That is correct. And that
Okay.
web address that's in the chat will take you to the page where it will be posted probably later by the end of the week.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Bird question. Let's see. Terry asked, if you flush the birds during a field survey, will they easily return to the nest?
Yeah, I think so. You're probably not going to see them flush. Particularly during daytime, they know they can run faster than you, and so you probably won't even, unless you do a call playback survey that we'll get into in a little bit. Unless you know they're there, they're probably going to run out ahead of you and circle back around. They probably won't take flight. When we do see birds is during flood events, and like I'm talking extreme flood events like storm surges, hurricanes, really wet conditions where they will appear on like the dikes and levees, and just because everything else is too wet for them. I'm sure they can swim, but they probably don't like to swim for very long. They like to stay relatively dry. And then during fire, like a prescribed burns, we'll see birds flying. And then during our active, when we're trying to we're doing the research and monitoring, doing captures, we do what's called a line drag, where we pull a rope that has milk bottles filled with rocks across the marsh surface to try to get them to flush. And the combination of that extensive amount of disturbance kind of coming at them, plus it being night, will cause them to take flight.
But do not try this at home.
No, that's that's under research permits and permissions and everything else. There's no reason to try to see them or try to cause them to flush or take flight, because we can detect them easier and better just using the call playback surveys or just actively listening.
Okay, next question. Is there an inland minimum habitat size for black rails in Florida?
We're going with 2 hectares for wetlands, especially the inland ones that are much less extensive. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about, and that wetland should have at least a portion of that be like the suitable habitat that we're talking about, the dense vegetation, dense grassy vegetation. It doesn't necessarily have to, the entire thing doesn't necessarily have to be absolutely suitable. But we feel like that's probably the minimum amount for one nesting pair to have the resources that they need to put off the nest.
Okay, here we have another housekeeping question. In addition to the recording, will the actual PowerPoint slides be available? I think we are sticking with just the recording at this point. And one more bird question. And I think you answered this already, but I'll go ahead and ask, do the birds have limited flying capabilities?
They're thought to be migratory, but we don't, so they can migrate. So they do have flying capabilities to migrate, say from northern marshes to southern marshes in the winter. But in reality, they don't necessarily like to fly far, especially when they're in their nesting area. They fly very infrequently and probably prefer not to fly, probably expose themselves to aerial predators and other things that you don't want to be exposed to. So they're not strong flyers, but they do fly fine.
Another migration question here for you. Can you explain more about what is known about their migration? I see they are in Florida year-round, but does that mean they don't migrate at all?
We don't know. We'd love to get some radios on these birds to kind of track that. That's probably not. It's probably at this point with regard to their population levels and trends, it's probably like a second tier of like what we need to know about the species, particularly in Florida. The assumption is that the birds in the Everglades are resident, and that there's probably some northern birds, probably from northern Florida, northern and inland Florida, that mix in with those birds during the winter. Resident birds in Florida, there's probably resident birds definitely in Everglades. There's probably resident birds in other parts of Florida, and there's probably a population of birds that migrate within Florida, and probably population of birds that migrate to Florida in the winter from farther north. But yeah, that's an area of study that we're just making some assumptions based on the numbers of birds that we see in the winter versus in some areas versus the number of birds that we see during nesting season. And by sea, when I say by sea, I mean by detect, because we often don't see them.
So another question in regards to minimum habitat size, could you just repeat your answer from before regarding the 2 hectare and at least partially being habitat?
Yeah, so the minimum wetland size that we were looking at for black rail, that would be 2 hectares as a footprint on the landscape. We think that, you know, the average home range size is right around 1 hectare for a nesting territory size to produce a nest, produce young. And so that kind of accounts for, in a small wetland, that accounts for having enough area to have the habitat and to have that water availability that they need for a nesting pair, with the assumption that probably not the entire area is absolutely perfect the entire time, if that makes sense. So at least, you know, at least a portion of that would need to be like that, there, dense vegetation. And as you saw in that flyover at in the South Water Management District, South Florida Water Management District, those patches can be fairly small. We don't have a good estimate of what that patch size is, but there are smaller patches that the birds are using. So we think that at least targeting any wetland over 2 hectares is appropriate, and having suitable habitat within that patch is required. Anything else? Caroline?
Hey, Kevin, it's Kendra. I think we may have lost Caroline, so I expect she will be finding her way back. There is a couple more questions from Sarah. We have, what are their main predators?
You know, they conceal and nest really well, and so if they're far enough, hopefully they're far enough away from terrestrial situations, but any ground nest, like whatever, you know, they're a ground nesting bird, and so they are exposed to whatever predators are around that can randomly come across their nests. So during nesting season, it's going to, you know, it's for the eggs and the chicks, it's going to be, you know, your raccoons and fox and probably black rats and those kinds of things. Snakes, I'm sure, are predators. And then because they nest and they kind of stay under that dense vegetation most of their time, they're not as exposed to avian predators. So with rare predators, I'm less concerned about hawks and owls and things like that. I don't think that's a major thing. Aside from the occasional northern harrier, I think those will probably be a predator, you know, a predator for the rails in certain conditions and in certain areas. But yeah, anything that, you know, if it's, you know, those ground nesting birds have a tough time with predators.
Great, thank you for that. Caroline is having some audio issues, so I'm sure she will intervene when she gets that sorted. I will throw another question at you while we're here. Any cohort mortality noted post waterfowl hunting season?
What was that?
Any cohort mortality noted
okay.
post-waterfowl hunting season?
No, rails, like there are states that have, and maybe, can't remember, I think Florida is included in this, but rails are a hunting species. But black rails aren't a targeted species for hunting. Although I think, and they're so rare that I don't think hunters are gonna flush them up very regularly. But I wouldn't be surprised if there has been occasion, especially when there was larger numbers of them on the landscape, that they may have gotten confused with like other species of rail, larger species, soars and things like that. But I don't know that there's necessarily been any recent documentation of birds that have been hunted, shot during hunting season.
Great, thank you for that. From my viewpoint, I think we're at questions, but we'll definitely screen them if you wanted to continue on with your presentation, and we'll hope that Caroline is back with us before your next break.
This is the break, so
Oh,
maybe if we can
okay.
take, what would you recommend, 5 minutes for?
Yeah,
Sure.
if we wanna take 5 minutes, that would be great. Say, well, we're at 10:57 Eastern. Does 11:05 sound reasonable?
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right, everybody, we're going to take a brief break, and Kevin will resume the presentation at 11:05 Eastern. Thank you.
Hey, any chance anyone can hear me?
Hey, Caroline, yes, we do have you back.
Yay!
Sorry about that. Thank you for getting that one sorted. We are currently on our break until 11:05 Eastern, but
Perfect.
confirmed you are on camera and you do have your audio back. So
Excellent, excellent.
great.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, this is Kendra. Welcome back. I'll call on Caroline to do another audio check to see that she is still with us and everything is sorted.
Oh, I hope it's working.
Yes, we've got
Okay.
you. All right, we are at 11:05, so I'll leave it over to you, Kevin and Caroline.
All right. Any more questions come in or any opportunity for the
Let's
last
see.
question now?
There is a question about the Black Rail call, whether we're gonna do a sample of that. I know you're gonna be talking about the callbacks later in the presentation. Do you have an audio clip or should I try to find one?
We did have an audio clip in the presentation, but it wasn't working over the present or the webinar situation. So, but the links that we'll provide at the end, there are audio files associated with those links, and just I would recommend people just Google Black Rail call, and there's plenty of them. It's variations of kick-a-kurt and he-do repeated. So, and there's some other vocalizations like growls and chirps and things like that you'll want to become familiar with if you're ever out looking for black rails in that habitat, that kind of prescribed habitat type. It's out there, and the first time I ever heard a black rail was in a non-normal habitat. It was in an old field adjacent to a tidal high marsh that had overgrown, and I was coming in from a marsh survey, and just kind of stopped to take notes or something, and literally under my feet, a black rail growled. It's pretty loud and pretty startling because it was like right under me, and that just gives you a sense that they move around the landscape. They may or may not be found in like the traditional like Spartina patens, high marsh, whatever. They might go into other areas of non-native vegetation, upland edge fringes if it's a little bit wetter than they like in the marsh and wetlands, and really love to be concealed. So this was a bird that was like right underfoot. So they can surprise you. So that's
there's one question that just came in regarding habitat, so I figured let's address that while we're still on this section before we move on.
Sure.
And you're really good at anticipating questions. Do exotic vegetation affect their habitat, or are they able to adapt to them, especially cattails?
They will. Taifa is in I don't know if you remember, but in the U.S. distribution map I showed, there's a population in the plains of Colorado, and in those wetland systems associated with the Missouri River, they are predominantly almost 100% cattail Taifa, and that's where the birds are nesting. And so that just goes to show that, and in Texas, they've shown up in like, mesquite with dense grassy vegetation on the mesquite, things like that. So that just goes to show that, our first, and I think I get into this, when you're looking at a wetland, your first evaluation is the vegetation structure there. Does it have dense grassy vegetation such that you can't necessarily see the ground? Is there, not that much woody vegetation? If the answer to those two questions is yes. Is it, is it kind of far away from, is it wetlands large enough, and is it far enough away from upland terrestrial trees and forests? The question is yes. The next thing is the habitat, and that's, I mean, is the hydrology, is the soil moisture, shallow water. If those two things occur and you're nesting during the nesting season, there's a good chance that might be habitat for black rail. I took landscape ecology from one of the founders of the discipline, Dr. Bob Gardner. And one of my favorite quotes from him was that most animals aren't botanists. They don't care if it's what type of grass it is, or what they are mostly interested in for a lot of species is just give me the structure, just give me the cover, give me what the thing I need is. I don't care if it's typha or sawgrass or spartina patens. I just want to be comfortable underneath this thing and feel safe.
Okay, good to go. Next.
All right. So we're going to get into site selection and survey design. We're going to talk a little bit more about habitat. I'll show you some more examples of kind of the habitat to look for. What you can see on the screen right now is a typical tidal salt marsh, and shows you kind of like the variety of habitat out there. And this is a situation that we see a lot within that entire landscape. There's probably patches of black rail habitat, like that dense grassy vegetation. And I use this because it's also a good thing to understand that you can't evaluate the density of the vegetation by looking across a marsh. You can't really do a roadside survey for habitat evaluation. You kind of need to get out there and walk around a little bit because what looks like dense enough kind of from this perspective, looking across the marsh, is not always true. So you have to get into it. And the one area of wood point out is the bottom right-hand corner. That looks like it might be dense enough. That's an area that I target. I get out there, walk across that salt pan, and see if that's dense enough. But that's just a cautionary note with regards to evaluating habitat. And we'll talk a little bit more about evaluating, doing a site assessment in a little bit. So you all are really almost all looking to evaluate proposed projects for black rails. So your primary question is the wetland diamond, assuming you're evaluating, you're in the wetland, is it suitable for black rails? And the fact that it really is fairly simple. They're difficult species. They're difficult species to understand. They're difficult species to detect. They're in harsh environments. They're just trying to make that Goldilocks living. But it's really about that vegetation structure, dense, grassy vegetation, having the hydrology, and the hydrology fluctuates through time, which makes it a little bit more difficult to understand. But if those factors are there, then we would recommend surveys. And then you want to think about, well, what's the determination? Then you get into what the proposed action is, how much is it going to impact the habitat? Is it going to absolutely remove habitat? Is it going to be a short-term impact where whatever's being done could be limited to a non-breeding season, and otherwise the habitat would persist, would continue to persist. So you get into some of timing of actions and things like that. So if you're almost anywhere in Florida, whether it be the coast, the Everglades, agricultural areas, ranches, meadows, prairie systems, if there's wetlands, there's pocket wetlands, if there's managed wetlands, if there's canals with a wetland fringe, you might be in black rail habitat. It's going to come to that, like does it have a suitable vegetation structure that they prefer? They also like this kind of, they don't probably prefer it, but they kind of like that wetland upland transition zone. Kind of the best example is in Everglades, where you have those tree islands. You look across the Everglades and there's those tree islands, and that represents the transition from a wetter, deeper wetland to a drier, more more terrestrial upland. And so they do kind of prefer those and it can be found in those wetland upland transitions that gives them that availability to move across the landscape and follow the water when they need to. So we look for tidal high marsh in like the Big Bend, Panhandle, upper northeast coastal Florida, Everglades, marl prairies, inland wet prairies, managed wetlands, impoundments. South Carolina, I think in South Carolina, the last remaining populations of black rails are in managed wetlands. Maybe more, like those, like canal systems in South Florida, where there's those wetland fringes along the edges of canals could be suitable. We are, the last several years, just beginning to understand the full breadth, like where these birds are in Florida and how they're using the landscape, how they're moving around, how they're responding to hydrologic conditions, how they're responding to flood events, and what that means for their population demography, all those things. And so we, basically we're relying on these key habitat characteristics that I'm trying to describe to drive our surveys, and that's why I suggest you ought to use to kind of drive your thought process and your your kind of chain of decisions with regard to whether or not a species might occur and a consultation should occur. So what we're looking at is very dense grassy herbaceous vegetation, rushes, grasses, sedges, spartina, sawgrass, invasive species. Yeah, like we documented them in invasive species in that reservoir that was being constructed. If it's vegetation, if they can't see the sky, they're going to be pretty happy. So if you can't see the ground, you might want to consider black rail. And I'm not certain that they're super successful in these smaller patches, but we've observed them in smaller patches of suitable habitat within a larger wetland complex. Now you're not going to find a black rail in a small patch of wetland within a forested system, like a small grassy wetland within a forested system. There's areas that I've been to in Big Cypress that, yeah, this is a cypress forest and there's an opening and the vegetation is dense enough, but they're just not going to be like within that little tree fall area or whatever. They want to be in kind of that open landscape, relatively treeless, definitely treeless, relatively brushless. Sparse to no woody vegetation, and that's in most circumstances. These birds are adaptable, and we are seeing in some areas of their range where, because of sea level rise, the marsh system is moving into fringing forests, and so you have the grassy herbaceous structure moving in underneath forest canopy that birds can occupy. It's not out of question. They're just trying to make a living out there, and they're trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so as they lose their habitat on one end of the system, they're trying to find it on another. So then you got the kind of correct idea of vegetation structure. Then you're looking at hydrology, and we're looking at moist soil at 3 centimeters of water for food production. They're small birds. They don't want to swim around. They don't like rapid changes in water and water levels. And so there's a lot of places in Florida where this can occur. Seeps, spring seeps in certain areas can provide that kind of condition in some of the prairie systems, things like that. They want to have that kind of elevation heterogeneity. They want to be able to, as the wet season approaches, they want to be able to like move across and follow the water if they can, and be able to like have refuge if a storm comes and they need to get their chicks to higher ground. They want to have some humps and bumps in that wetland. So that's also important when looking for black rails. The species, like when we are trying hard to find the bird, they're hard to detect, and that's partly because of their low population levels. They're not a common species across the landscape, but they are just difficult to find. They're most they're easiest to detect during the nesting season when the males are highly territorial and they're responding to playback calls. But outside of that, the ability to detect them declines very dramatically. We're lucky that we're in Florida, in the mid-Atlantic where I used to work. The peak activity for black rails was midnight to 3 a.m. So I was out there at the middle of the night in these coastal marshes trying to detect these things. They're crepuscular in Florida. So when you do surveys, be thankful that you're not in the mid-Atlantic, because that was some tough going. As I've mentioned before, they are so dependent on moist soil and shallow water, which is why you can go to a wetland and see the vegetation. You can see the vegetation structure, but they just might not be there. But they might not be there just at that point in time. You might be there in December or in February when it's drier, or you might be there in July when it's too wet. So evaluating, so that's why when you are in a wetland, you kind of have to understand kind of the landscape and the hydrology, what the water delivery is for that system. Is it an Everglades system? Is it a prairie system? Where are you getting the water from? And does it make sense that maybe if you're there, if you're at a location in December, you have to kind of imagine what that might look like in March, April, May, June. What would that look like with what you know about how the water gets to that wetland and how for nesting season? So just because they aren't protected 1 year doesn't mean it isn't habitat, and under different hydrologic conditions, it wouldn't be there in another year, in the next year. So here's some examples of what I'm talking about. With this is kind of like a couple of pictures of ideal vegetation, like of habitat. Not thinking about the hydrology aspect, just assume that what's under this vegetation is moist soil or shallow water. And so what you're looking for is this, that kind of, you have that thick thatch. So oftentimes it's thatch from the previous season, and have the new season vegetation, the green vegetation is moving in. You kind of got that column structure. And this is the kind of habitat where structure where it's almost 100% canopy. Underneath that are spaces. You can walk and kind of pull the vegetation away. There's spaces you can see, areas where they can, it's actually like little trails and open areas that they can, 5-6 inch bird can run around underneath that quite easily. This is vegetation that isn't thick thatch from the surface of the wetland to the sky. It's within that structure. There's a lot of area underneath there that birds run around in, build their nests in. It's like a little trails and cave system. And you're gonna want, this is another, I think this is another picture from Avon Park. There's a little bit of brush around, but again, it's like really dense, grassy, herbaceous vegetation. This is the first picture was a tidal high marsh system. The second picture is a inland prairie system. Structurally, not a whole lot different. Like species-wise, grass species-wise, way different. You can see the similarities, even though you're in very different regions of the state. And so this is the things that, like, this is, when you're doing like kind of a rapid assessment, like, oh, like this wetland, what are we gonna do? Is there should we consider black rail? If you walk out in the wetland and you see what's on the left, or look across the wetland and you see what's on the right, and walk in there, yeah, this looks suitable for black rails. If you look across the wetland and walk through there, and you see like look across this wetland, looks pretty okay. It looks like pretty grassy, but like you can see in that foreground, it's pretty sparse. Like the stem density is pretty low. So this is not something I would consider suitable habitat. Now, if you had a patch of the picture on the left interspersed amongst this this system on the right, then you might have something, because that does occur. That's fairly common, is to have that patchiness within a wetland system, and we'll see a little bit of that in the next slide. So this is the same area in the South Water Management District with colleagues that detected, I think 9 or 10 calling males across, along this levee system. And on the left is a canal, and then between the canal and the levee is this kind of a 50 or 70 meter wide patch or a strip of heterogeneous wetlands. And on the other side is was it flow equalization basin. And so we will fly this, and with any luck, we'll see some areas where the birds could potentially find suitable. You can see with this drone video that as you fly over, you can see down through that vegetation. If you can see down through the vegetation, it's probably not suitable. But if you look between as you move to the right, that kind of transition from the center to the levee system, that kind of transition zone has a considerable non-dense vegetation. But all throughout here, it's fairly dense, even in the central portion of that strip. And I think this goes for maybe like a half mile or so. We're not going to fly that much, but this is the kind of situation where it's just an example of a heterogeneous marsh system that has kind of a very variation in topography and a variation in vegetation density. So the birds are actually occurring kind of throughout here. So as she pans down, the area to your left looks very suitable. Like I could see a bird nesting in the area to the left. To the right, you can see through and see that you can see the water and less dense vegetation. So the use of it's often, definitely recommend getting out into the wetlands and evaluating that habitat structure, evaluating the topography in the soil directly. But if possible, drones are useful to kind of do that work when you can do it. And it kind of gives you that overhead perspective that you can't get looking across the top of the wetlands from the road or levee or things like that. So when we think about doing survey designs, it's always like, well, what's your question? And most of the links that we'll send you, the protocols that have been developed for understanding population levels and trends and evaluating habitat like pre-post, some level of monitoring. We're trying to see changes, and so none of the protocols out there are necessarily specific to what you all are interested in, is like evaluating a project for the species that we're targeting. And so we're primarily really what we want to do is look for presence, absence. We want to understand where those that the species is there, that occurs there. Certainly when you do surveys, please record the number. Like that's really important for us, is to record not only whether or not they're there, but how many calling males did you have, things like that. But with regard to setting up a survey for a potential project, you kind of have you know where the limits of impact are, right? And you kind of know what habitat is within those, what habitat is within those limits of your impact. This doesn't require like some systematic sampling. Like put your survey points in the most what you think is the best and most appropriate habitat and the most suitable habitat. Sites that have the appropriate vegetation structure and the appropriate hydrologic conditions. Again, just because it's dry in December doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be wet during nesting season. So you have to like think about what that transition might look like during what that habitat might look like with regard to the hydrology, with regard to the soil moisture and water levels during their nesting period. And so outside nesting period, you're really evaluating structure, and then trying to make some assumptions about what that might look like within the nesting period to guide your decisions about surveys. And like I said before, wetlands should be a minimum of 2 hectares, even if not entirely suitable habitat. Should be enough to support at least one nesting pair. For survey points should be a minimum of 400 meters apart. You don't want to oversample. Like you don't need to put points close together. You want to get enough dispersion so you're not detecting the same bird more than once at different points. The detectability issues. So we are really suggesting to get a good handle on the presence of the species at a wetland. The survey should be conducted a minimum of 5 times within the nesting season. This is scientifically based due to probabilities of detection. And so yeah, it's the difficulty in what we're doing is we're trying to say something about habitat under very dynamic conditions and situations. I think I've communicated the message that outside of the habitat structure, it's all about the hydrology. And yeah, they're going to move around, and as long as that kind of hydrologic situation, habitat structural situation is stable from year to year, one set of surveys should be enough. So, but that might suggest that before an action takes place, if you've done a survey and something changes, that's a consideration that you need to think about. If the conditions change from one year to the next. Any questions?
Yes. Let's see. Actually, I am going to take the first question.
Yay. Thank you, Caroline.
There we go. Is purchase of herbaceous wetland mitigation credits sufficient to offset impacts to suitable habitat for the black rail? So that's something you would have to work with your consultation biologist on, because obviously it would depend on where the impacts are taking place, what sort of impacts are occurring, the mitigation bank itself, what is it designed to do? Can it support black rails, etc.? So yeah, work with your consultation biologist on that one, but it is certainly worth a conversation.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have mitigation banks associated, or black rails associated with mitigation banks, at least not yet.
Yeah. Let's see, this one's for you. would there be guidance on the size of wetland that would require survey? And you mentioned the fringe. Would that extend into uplands?
I would recommend, like, if it's, I think the way these birds are moving around the landscape, I think the 2 hectare would, I think below 2 hectares, we're not worried about. Certainly you can reach out to us and like talk to us about anything that's kind of like on the smaller side, but it would be hard for me at this point to really discount smaller wetlands in the 2 to 10 hectare size. I think, they're, like I said, they're moving around the landscape, they're finding what they need somehow. They're detecting those conditions. And I wouldn't be surprised if they dropped into smaller wetlands. With regard to the fringe wetland, the fringe terrestrial areas, that's the structure, like that. Those are kind of like pretty novel places that birds have, where birds might occur. So first blush, a forest that's got an understory of dense grassy vegetation, it would be hard to like make that assumption that that's suitable habitat without having some prior knowledge of the system, of having some prior knowledge of the presence of the species in the adjacent wetlands. It's probably not like the most optimal conditions, but if it's one of those situations where it's just happens to be a super wet year, and the birds are usually in the wetland most years, but because of the super wet year, they've kind of moved into like a more upland, grassy understory vegetation. I wouldn't put it past them.
Okay, let's see. This is just based, I'm combining a couple of questions that are coming up. So can you reiterate the fact that the published population survey guidelines that we have available for surveys, we're following the general structure of a survey, but not the intensity of survey points that are explained in the protocol?
Yeah, so those the published protocols that we have that were published by the service 2 years ago, something like that. Those are for monitoring populations. So the protocols with regard to how to sample at a point, how to sample at a point, those are all completely valid and what we recommend. But how you set up your surveys is dependent on the site, depending on your needs. You may want to, for whatever reason, evaluate pre and post construction or whatever, and that might require some a different sampling design. But with regard to like how we move forward, really we're trying to get to presence, and so what I'm suggesting is to try to minimize your effort as much as possible by kind of sampling the areas that are most appropriate, most suitable habitat. There's no reason to be in like super sparse vegetation listening to marshlands. You want to put your points where they need to be, but minimum 400 meters apart, whatever that looks like for that site, and visit it at least 5 times within the nesting season, and 7 days apart. I think I get to that later. You want we're recommending call playback surveys which means you're broadcasting a call with the speaker. And chronic playback surveys can be detrimental to that local population because the birds will spend more time trying to defend its territory against, you know, that fake call than doing what it needs to do. So, and it's part of, you know, our conservation measures. So that's why we're trying to maintain surveys be conducted no fewer than 7 days apart. So what are your considerations when you're setting up surveys? Like find the appropriate habitat, put your points in there, and spread them out across the landscape at least 400 meters apart.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, next one. Are they tolerant to switch cane dominated marshes and or Kogon grass dominated ecotones?
If they, you know, if it's dense enough and the hydrology is there, you know, if the grasses are dense enough, the cane is dense enough, they can't see the sky, and there's hydrology is appropriate. I can't see why they, you know, wouldn't be there. Floating mat, you know, we've got birds and floating mats of Cuban bulrush. It's, you know, I'd say they're just trying to, you know, this dynamic landscape we have in Florida, they're just trying to find that like Goldilocks spot, and they'll try whether or not, like, that's the thing. Presence is one thing, whether or not they're productive, whether or not it's a sink, source or a sink, is another thing. That's not really a question we're trying to answer. We want to, in the end, we want to provide as many opportunities, regardless of hydrologic condition, regardless of if it's a flood or a drought year, for these birds to be able to persist on the landscape.
Okay, is foraging habitat similar to nesting habitat?
Yeah, foraging habitat is, you know, is really driven by that hydrology aspect. So that's probably the primary reason why we have that moist soil to shallow water, is because that's what's going to produce the insects that they eat. So foraging habitat, nesting habitat is the same, and in fact, as you know, they follow the water when they produce. Once they produce young, they'll follow that kind of moist soil to shallow water with their young as they're brooding them, and lead them to the best conditions, the most productive areas.
Next, hold on, let's see. Sorry. What observations would be indicative of black rails being present in a location, calls, nests, etc.? And we're sort of getting to that in the next section with the survey, the callbacks. So how about we skip that question until we get through the next section? This one I'll answer this one. Are the surveys required if suitable habitat is present, or can one just assume presence of black rails and move to mitigation or BMP measures? Due to the variability seasonally for the habitat to be suitable, how long are surveys, positive or negative results, good for? So if you want to assume presence, so first of all, I'll say again, it depends on the project. But if you want to assume presence for your project, we can definitely go that way. The only exception I might add is if it's an area that we already know is high quality, high productive black rail area, and where we already have data on densities or nesting or information, then we may pull surveys or other materials into it. But for other sites, yes, we can assume presence. Let's see. And what was the second part of the question? Oh yeah, due to variability seasonally for the habitat, how long are surveys good for? As long as the conditions have not changed on the ground, and I think that's what you're getting at, your surveys are valid. Kevin, what did we decide? 2 years? However, if conditions do change, so the hydrology changes, then you'd probably have to resurvey. Let's see, there was another one, how long is the survey valid? Yeah, depending on habitat, if we don't have any changes to the habitat, it's 2 years. And Kevin, I think you're getting to the nesting season. You have a chart in your presentation on that. Yeah, so we're getting to that. We'll answer that in a moment. And will there be updates to the GIS data for range consultation areas? So I think right now we do have a map in IPAC. And last time I saw it covered quite a bit of Florida. So I don't know if there's going to be anything more specific than that. Are you aware of anything else? Would habitat adjacent to roadways be considered suitable? That one's for you.
Yeah, if it's got the conditions. Roadways don't necessarily, like road noise isn't necessarily a significant disturbance factor. I think it's chronic enough that they would get used to it. They're not going to like nest right on the medians, but if it's a marsh, if there's a marsh adjacent to the roadway, within, they could be detected within 50 or 100 meters of that road.
Okay. Yeah, and I was just looking at ECOS for the map, and it looks like most of Florida is covered under that. So if it has suitable wetland habitat, I think that's what we're addressing. All right, I think those were all our questions. Some of these are going to be answered in the next section, so I'm pawning off until we get through that. And if your question has not been answered, please feel free to restate it, and we'll definitely get to it. All right, Kevin.
Nice. We're in the home stretch. There's not a whole lot left for you guys to know. Hopefully that makes you happy, and we'll get you off to some lunch. So what we covered so far is like the what. We're interested in our entire species fairly threatened black rail. Small, dark bird, doesn't like to be seen, more often heard than seen. Why? That's the question that kind of drives how you might approach the site assessment and how you might set up your sampling design if a survey is recommended. So evaluate proposed projects for impacts under ESA Section 7, where like suitable habitat within wetlands greater than 2 hectares. Like most of Florida is going to have potentially have inland Florida, coastal Florida, Everglades. There's wetlands. It's a wet state. So yeah, like just because you're in Central Florida doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about black rails. There's 2 critical time periods. Florida is complicated again because it's we're probably the only region that has 2 different survey periods. But in Everglades, from Lake Okeechobee south, the nesting period is middle of February to middle of May. In the north central Gulf Coast, salt marshes and interior, it's the middle of April and middle of July. And then, that's kind of how we're, the time periods that we're thinking about with regards to nesting and impacts to nesting habitat. But then for there's a time period in the year where the adults do a full molt and they're like Canada geese, they become flightless, and so they're more vulnerable to certain actions where they just can't fly. And so for Florida, from in the Everglades in the south, it's 16 May to 16 July, to middle of May to middle of July. And for the rest of the state, it's the middle of July to the middle of September to accommodate flightless chicks, coming off the coming off the nest and late nesting season. Flightless adults, they're just more vulnerable. We don't want to add additional potential mortality actions to that vulnerable life stage. Now it gets to how. Like you've identified an area that has suitable habitat. It probably has the hydrology given the habitat type and what you know of the system. You've got kind of a sampling design. You have like some points out in the wetland that seem like you should probably do a survey. And so what we do for black rails is what's known as call response surveys. And this is to use a speaker and a recorded call of black rails to elicit a response from the territorial male. It's kind of like an avian point counts, and you listen. There's a listening period, but you want to try to increase your detectability by introducing a novel male to the situation. And fortunately, like I said before, the time of the series are crepuscular, so 30 minutes before sunrise to 3 hours after sunset, or after sunrise, or 3 hours before sunset to 30 minutes after sunset. So it gives you an opportunity, kind of, you want to think about that with regard to workload, logistics, things like that. Stay safe out there. There sometimes in isolated areas, just be fortunate you're not there at midnight. And so, so basically, it's you go to your point location and you do this call playback with the speaker and recording. All those details will be like the speaker, like the speaker Box Pro is like the one that we use most. All the recommendations are in the links that we'll send that will be available at the end of the presentation. So you go to your point, you have a 10-minute call playback session where the first 5 minutes you just passively just listening, just trying to listen for that kiki-cur or kiki-do call, and then you may or may not hear the bird. Even if you do hear the bird within that first 5 minutes, still do the call playback. That might elicit other birds in the area to call, so you can kind of get an idea of the number of birds in the area. And that's it. You do your call playbacks, record your data. There's example data sheets in the links that we'll send. And again, the protocols and those links are for monitoring, population monitoring purposes. So we are adapting for this purpose. We're adapting that for detection at these proposed action sites. So some of you may have heard about automated recording units. These are microphones that are set up, that can be set up in a wetland system and turned on to record whatever sounds are out in the environment, and hopefully black rails. It's something that's been suggested, used, promoted for black rails, and something you might want to consider for some of your sites where it makes sense. With all technology like this, there's pluses and minuses. You can set up a microphone in an area, let it go for a couple weeks on the batteries that's in there, and you'll have enough memory to record all those things. So you only need to visit the system once. The drawback is you have to analyze all those audio files. And we are working with Cornell and others to kind of develop some machine learning to kind of filter out a lot of the non-calls, but we're still getting back quite a number of false positives, false negatives. And that's primarily due, we think that's due to like the variation in dialects of black rails across the range. So, and within, just differences between birds. So what that system's only going to get better over time with more positive, with getting more known black rail calls in different variations into the system for it to learn from. But it's still a lot of time in it can end up being a lot of time in the office listening to those audio files and trying to figure out if you got a positive detection or not. But a great, there's certain circumstances. Maybe it's a more isolated site. Maybe it's more of a dangerous site. You don't want to be there in the morning or evening or something like that. Where automatic recording might be useful. There's a lot of information out there. We don't yet have protocols specific for ARUs, but there's we have some recommendations about that, some guidelines, and a group that's working on developing protocols for automated recording units. So it might be something that you might want to use in your surveys and evaluating a site. My contact information will be here. You can contact myself or Caroline if you have more questions, or there's probably a lot of information online about black rails and automated recording units. We've used them in Lox Hatch National Wildlife Refuge and St. Mark's, other places. So yeah, it's just when you're thinking about how you're going to do surveys, if they're recommended and appropriate, it's one of those tools in the toolbox. So you get to look into it. The picture is at one of our sites at Avon Park. So our biologist putting servicing an automated recording unit. It's much more like they don't have to be that big and bright and obvious. But you do want to get this microphone above the vegetation, things like that. Omnidirectional. That's at a Air Reserve base, Air Force range, so they had to be noticeable in the field for base operations. And yeah, here's your resources. So there's the at these links, there's the protocols, there's all the information you could use. Protocols, data sheets, sound files for the call playbacks, sound files for learning the calls, everything. So please go to these, and that will help you understand what you need to do at the survey points. But like I'm giving you the guidance on what your consideration should be for setting up your surveys at a location, and things like that. And I think that's it.
All right, we
any
have
more
some questions.
Caroline, I think I try to send the link to a YouTube video. Did that come through in the questions box, or did you get anything from me?
Let's see.
It's a nice, maybe I can drop it in the chat. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have it here, but let me go ahead and start with some of the questions. We have a couple of questions regarding who we would consider qualified surveyors to conduct these surveys. At the moment, we don't have a specific guideline on who it would be, but because these birds do have various dialects, it would need to be an experienced birder that could not only be able to follow the protocol for the surveys, but also recognize when there are variations in the response calls. Kevin, do you have anything else for that one?
No, other than like, y'all are scientists, like, like you're out there, just learn the calls, spend some time listening to calls online in the resources file that we're sending, things like that, and just become accustomed to what the bird sounds like. There's enough recordings out there that kind of give you an idea of what different calls and different types of calls and different volumes of calls. They can be quite quiet if they're far away. In the protocol, there's going to be a limit. You're not going to want to be out there when it's rainy or when it's windy. There's going to be a limit to that. I think it's like under 10 or 15 miles an hour wind, because above that wind condition just gets hard to hear the birds. So pay attention to those things to maximize your effectiveness out there and going out during the right weather conditions so that you can detect the birds. But it's like if you don't need to learn all the calls and songs of songbirds. This is a pretty distinctive call and stuff. So spend some time preparing yourself.
Okay, when using the ARUs, would you still only use the calls recorded during the crepuscular survey period?
I think that's one of the things that we're trying. I think it depends on how long you want to keep the thing out there. I would recommend programming it to be during the crepuscular period, just to save on battery, and since that's a recommendations we have for Florida, so save on battery and memory space, so you don't have to just doing a shorter number of hours. You have to record everything all night.
However, if you document black rail calls, then you've documented presence.
Yep. And that's, I mean, and you know, if you get to a point where you're like, you put out an ARU and you document something, you know, there's a bunch of us that can like help verify those if you're looking for expertise.
Let's see. While conducting surveys near a roadway, how do you handle roadway noise in regards to background noise levels within the survey data sheet? At what point does the survey data become unreliable?
That's up to your discretion. Like I would, if it's that loud, you know, I would, you know, maybe time your surveys to when there's less traffic. Try to get away from, like, even if it's not within. So if you have if it's roadway work and you're looking at like the limits of the extent of the project being like 50 meters off the road or something like that. Maybe do your surveys, walk out into the marsh, get a little bit farther away from the road to see if you're getting birds in that area where you can hear better. So there's a number of ways you can deal with road noise depending on the site.
Okay, if there are any other questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat now. Let's see. Oh, yay. Joy just said she was able to get on the internet and hear the Black Rail call. I hope you enjoyed. Will we need concurrence with the agency for moving forward on surveys or projects? Please do coordinate with your service representative if you're planning on doing surveys. Would the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognize the use of ARUs as a creditable survey procedure during consultation? It depends about that. So yes, we would consider ARUs depending on who was doing the setup and actually who was doing the analysis, because that's the hardest part of the ARUs. They're easy to put out, but please remember that it's the analysis that's a bit tougher on those. So talk to your service representative.
Yeah, and there's guidance out there, and if that's really something you want to look at, I can probably find some guidelines that we've developed specifically for ARUs. But yeah, in reality, like that's the best source of evidence, like to have like positive detection recorded.
If you determine presence, is there a buffer calculation from that point to determine habitat impact? It's going to depend on your project. So different projects are going to have different impacts. So that one's, I can't give a specific radius. It'll depend on the project evaluation. Those are not satisfying answers, even to me. Will there be a species key developed?
Yeah.
Excellent.
You can do that. There's examples out there, I think, that need to be modified for Florida, but you can look into that.
Let's see, I'm going through last couple of questions. Give me a moment. Okay, David is asking very specific questions regarding to the various types of calls that Black Rails have.
What was that question again?
And
Sorry.
regarding identification of the various calls and dialects. So I think that's why we ask that it's somebody familiar with birds and survey protocol so that they can identify those various types of calls.
I mean, when I talked about the different dialects, like there's probably not, to an experienced observer, a bird calling in South Carolina and bird calling in Florida might sound a little bit different. But for most people, it's basically, it's gonna be the same call, the same chirp, the same growl, just like slightly faster, slightly slower, louder, whatever. But the kind of more important thing is just understanding what the different calls are, like between kiki-kur and the growl and the chirp, because they'll do different things at different times, depending on what the situation is. But the resources out there are completely fine for understanding what those things sound like and kind of becoming familiar with those calls.
Does the automatic recording analysis look for all call types?
Yeah. But we initially focused on the kiki-do, the calls.
Once presence is verified, do you keep doing the survey to finish out the 5-minute survey, the 5 minimum survey days? I think at that point, once you've established presence, then you know that the species is there, and you can start the consultation process with a presence.
Yep.
Somebody asked if you could display the green, yellow, blue range map you had earlier on in your presentation and explain what the colors mean.
Now, the colors are just different regions. So, yeah, so the yellow is kind of your typical tidal salt marsh that has a high marsh fringe. That occurs like kind of Tampa, north through Big Bend, and the Panhandle, and in northeast Florida from say Cape Canaveral up to the Georgia line. That's the yellow is like your tidal salt marsh. That kind of habitat type becomes less and less suitable as you go south because it's a smaller tidal range, things like that. The blue is kind of your inland wetlands, inland freshwater wetlands, your prairies and things like that, ranches, other kind of like inland freshwater wetlands, St. John's Water Management District, like the Upper St. John's River, things like that. And then the green is the Everglades and the agricultural areas between the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee. The birds are using each of those systems differently with regard to like, and the hydrology is kind of like significantly different between each of those regions. That's why I've kind of pulled them out into different areas. But that doesn't change the way how we would approach like evaluating habitat structure and function and hydrology. It's just the hydrology part changes with regard to like what's actually delivering the water in each of those regions to make it suitable for black rails.
And Colin would like to see the map that's next as well.
That's just the Everglades watershed, basically.
Okay, let's see. Another habitat question. Would an existing stormwater pond adjacent to suitable habitat and pond, would an existing stormwater pond adjacent to suitable habitat is now exhibiting suitable habitat, would the pond be considered habitat too?
Yeah, I mean, there's examples in Maryland of birds utilizing stormwater treatment facilities. So if the vegetation structure is there and the hydrology is there, it's potential to be used by black rails and suitable for black rails.
I think the question is more about as the water gets deeper into the pond, do we consider that habitat? Or is it just the shallower grass area?
It's just
If it impacts the grass area, I would include that in our consultation.
yeah. If the pond is like an open water pond, then yeah, it's not. But if what happens in that kind of open water pond influences, like management of that pond or whatever, influences the fringing wetlands where there's suitable habitat and even potential black rail documentation, then yeah, the entire pond would be considered the wetland that the bird's depending on, because the water's going to fluctuate, things like that.
So we're done with questions, but I wanted to make one more quick announcement, and that is, so this webinar is sort of part one in what we're hoping to have a series of trainings. Part two, we're hoping to have an in-field component. So we're working on setting up possibly 3 different on-site trainings, maybe South Central and North Florida, where we're looking at habitat and actually practicing the survey protocol. So be on the lookout. I think the DOT crew has everybody's emails that participated in this webinar. So, we'll send out a notice when we have that set up. And Kevin, unless you have anything else, I'm going to turn it over to our DOT partners.
I'm good. Just thank you for everybody for watching and listening. Appreciate all the questions and interactions. And if we're able to do some, if it's something that we move forward with, the field visits, hope to see you guys out there.
Great. So thanks for everybody for attending, and a special thanks to the service, Kevin and Caroline. That was a great presentation, some really good information. Just remember that it is been recorded, and you will find that recording on our Protected Species and Habitat page probably by the end of the week. The address is on the slide here, but it was also put into the chat. So copy that down, and we'll be in touch with further information as it's developed for the in-field part of the training. And everyone have a really great day. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.